Outside of the MCU currently, Fox's X-Men franchise is perhaps the longest rating superhero movie franchise in the 21st century, let alone the one where most people have a fond memory for it. It's been entertaining audiences for almost 20 years straight, with Fox taking the most beloved source material and bringing along a lot of fan favorite characters, super cool action sequences, memorable events, fascinating stories, and ultimately a lot of backlash from fans over the years. 19 years later, and the backlash hasn't really stopped. The Last Stand is criticized heavily for killing off fan favorites, having the ending add up to nothing, and how messy and unfocused the narrative was. Origins Wolverine was worse with this, with being boring, cliched, or pissing off fans at every turn with certain portrayals of different characters. Apocalypse confused the hell out of a lot of people, with Bryan Singer directing, who is still involved in allegations to this day, what initially served as a soft reboot of the franchise, thanks to Days of Future's Past breaking the timeline. But then, we have X-Men Dark Phoenix. After what many considered to be a phenomenal send-off with Logan, people assumed that the X-Men franchise had the perfect send-off to his 20-year-long crusade, so the continued reports of reshoots and failed test screenings and even the mediocre trailer for Dark Phoenix didn't really do any of us favors, and our worst fears were confirmed when the movie was finally released. I will say this though, unlike whatever the hell Dark Fate showed me, I know that compared to all of that, Dark Phoenix actually does what it sets out to do. But the main issue with that is that it does what it sets out to do so pissing horribly that there's no joy or even any ironic laughs to be had with it. This time around, the X-Men go to space to save a few astronauts only for a cosmic force of energy to rip inside Jean Grey, thus turning her into the most powerful X-Men of all, as well as the most dangerous entity on the planet. The team is torn apart by this and needs to decide whether or not the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. Outside of this being a story that we didn't want to see screwed up for a second time, it was made even worse by the plethora of abysmal production values left by the multitude of reshoots and the god-awful betrayal of a storyline. I don't want to go too deeply into it, but here's all I will say. The first half makes no sense to anybody who hasn't seen the animated series, the second and third half make no sense to anybody, period. And just like Dark Fate, the film just comes off as really bad fanfiction. Almost all the action sequences are just lackluster. Seeing the X-Men do their usual shtick just feels less impactful and memorable since we've already seen almost every combination as to how they can work. But even in this instance, they never truly raised the skill up to a degree that left me invested, especially since we all know how exactly it's going to turn out. There's no unpredictability factor to any of these fights. The only action sequence in the entire film that actually tried to impress me was the very last one, the train sequence. But even with that one satisfactory action scene, it didn't help. The overall editing was abysmal. Even the directing, for that matter, is about as generic as it comes and has nothing like unique technique or style or method of any kind. It just proves that Simon Kinberg just wasn't the right person to direct this movie. I was going to ask what the deal was it to even have someone like Kinberg directed, who has never directed a movie, by the way, but none of the cast members, believe it or not, actually wanted to return for another X-Men movie. They wouldn't come back unless Simon took a giant leap of faith for them, so if anything, it's the cast's fault for putting him into the situation and making it worse, due to the very simplistic directing and scarcely underplayed dialogue. All of these classic characters too, like, my god, what did they do to you? Let me just say right here, right now, the acting varies a lot here. Despite none of the cast members wanting to return, people like James McAvoy, Ty Sheridan, and Nicholas Hoult actually try to give it their all here. But Sophie Turner, Alexandra Shipp, Evan Peters, just as an example, they're barely given much to do, and they don't seem to even care that much. Even the veteran actors like Jennifer Lawrence, Michael Fassbender, and Jessica Chastain, like, my god, they just look and feel dead inside. Now, if I were to explain everything wrong with the characters here too, we'll be here all day, so let's just say this is one of the many ways the dialogue and the film itself downplays a good chunk of them, and that mostly resonates back to, again, the mediocre script, which pretty much has all of these characters spell melodramatic exchanges that lack genuine emotional substance. The protagonists are useless, underutilized, are barely even in the damn movie, or surprisingly unlikable, while the antagonists are just there for the sake of having a bad guy. And the pacing of the plot itself, at least from a story standpoint, just spreads all over the goddamn place with no rhyme or reason. Yeah, the research were clearly in full effect here, so let me just explain what's happening here. Shortly after the first failed test screening, Fox had to go back and do extensive research to completely restructure the plot because the film was allegedly considered to be eerily similar to Captain America Civil War out of all films, and they had to restart from scratch more than once since the film was too close to Civil War for them to even get away with it. They also had to restructure the ending too, which, by the way, ruins any momentum the first two acts might have built up, by the way. Yeah, it was their intentions to actually use the Skrulls in Dark Phoenix, but Captain Marvel got to them first. So what did they do? They ripped off the ending to Ang Lee's Hulk. Seriously, just look at these two back to back. Tell me you don't see the similarity here. But oh no, it doesn't stop there. You can literally tell when these reshoots have taken place. A character will either go from a different mood swing, the tone will just dramatically shift from one scene to the next, or an actual character will disappear. They'll literally disappear. It's an episode of Dora, we have to pull out the map to be like, where are we going to find this character? Not only did they manage to screw up the Dark Phoenix storyline again for a second time, they completely managed to mangle everybody and everything involved, from the characters, the acting, the directing, the editing, and even some of the more enjoyable aspects of the movie. They deserve to be in a better movie, you know? It's not as potentially risk-taking as Apocalypse seemed to be, not as remotely interesting with the subject matter or even social commentary as The Last Stand provided with us once you get over the BS decisions, and it wishes it can be a fraction as entertaining as X-Men Origins Wolverine. Yes, I said that. Say what you will about Disney and the MCU, but one can only hope that whatever direction they decide to take the X-Men, there's nowhere to go from here but up. Again, one can only hope.